All right, this is the final part. I hope if I can do this in 15 minutes of the Unit 5, everything, what I call the everything else lecture. All right, and let me just tell you how this is going to work. Thursday, probably Thursday morning between like 10:30 and noon, we're going to have a video conference, and I'm going to ask you one at a time 4 questions. If you get 3 right, you get 100%. Okay. All right, so let's go on here. And so take detailed notes here because you're going to turn this in for a grade. And this is your study guide, literally your study guide. So should the budget be balanced according to economists? Per most economists, should it be balanced? No. Here's what they think you should do. They think that when you're in a recession, you should run a deficit. The government should increase spending. This is pure Keynesian economics. Remember John Maynard Keynes, the economist. This is called Keynesian economics. And it's what we practice. Whenever there's a recession, you should run a deficit. You should borrow money. And the government should spend it just to drive up aggregate demand. And then, after you've done that, to end your recession, when there's an inflationary gap, you should spend less money than you're bringing in taxes, and so you should have a surplus then. And so theoretically, if you run recession deficits during recessions and surpluses when inflationary gaps, your debt will be zero. That's the theory. Of course, it never happens. That's one big problem, and I'm not trying to be political here, but remember, this is a political class. Trump has had up until the last month the hottest economy in the world, and he gave such a big tax cut that we were running deficits. We should not have been running deficits. Now we have this crisis, and I'm not attacking him. Obama had huge deficits as well. And remember my theory that you shouldn't just blame the president. You should also look at who's in Congress. Okay. And so the deal is, anyway, since in the 3.5 years of the Trump presidency, we've run these deficits with the hottest economy in the world. We should have been running surpluses, so we could have paid off some of the debt from the Obama years. And again, I'm not blaming Obama either. I'm not trying to blame anybody. When he came into power, he had a recession he was trying to get us out of. That's the way the theory works. Now we're in a bona fide emergency, and we need to run deficit spending, but our debt is very, very high. And that's about as political as I'm going to get. I'm not attacking either side. Actually, to be honest with you, I'm attacking both sides. We should not have this huge debt. Anyway, moving on here, but we do. I'm just a high school teacher. Nobody listens to me anyway. Hopefully you do. All right, so no, the economy, the budget should not be balanced based on what most economists think. Next topic, debt to GDP ratio. This is actually pretty simple here. What you do, it's one way of rating the financial health of countries. Remember, we talked about the 3 different things where you measure countries: inflation, unemployment, and GDP. What you do, if they owe $10 and their GDP is 100, then their debt to GDP ratio is 10%. If they owe $10 and the GDP is $200, their debt to GDP ratio is 5%. Okay, I'm going quickly here. Make sure you're writing all this down for your notebook grade. And here is what the U.S. debt to GDP ratio was around 104, 105% in 2015 and 2017. All right, the concept of implicit liabilities. Okay, these are spending promises made by governments that are effectively a debt, despite the fact they're not included in the usual debt statistics. For instance, we owe, when people retire, we owe them their Social Security. A lot of time that is not included in the budget. So an implicit liability is something that you owe, but it's not part of your budget calculations. I remember my first year teaching economics, I just assumed that all kids, their parents paid their college expenses. And I had probably over half my AP kids tell me, say, my parents aren't giving me anything. And I was kind of shocked. My parents paid my way. I paid for my first 2 years. I graduated in 3, but I paid for my freshman and sophomore year, and they paid for my junior and senior year. And my wife and I paid for our kids' college. They both got the lower level Bright Futures, but we consider that an implicit liability. We're going to pay our kids college, but apparently a lot of parents don't. That's not a criticism, but that's an example. We just knew that we were going to do that. Both of my kids right now, because of this recession, stand to possibly lose their jobs. And they actually room together. There's three of them, my two kids, and they have a roommate, and they've roomed together off and on for years. They have a deal amongst themselves. If either one of them lose their jobs, they're going to move back home. So even though my kids are, my son is 27 or 28, I should know it's an implicit liability that if he ever needs help, we're going to help him. Targeted federal funds rate. Now, remember, I sometimes say there's 3 or 4 Fed tools. The 3 Fed tools are increase or decrease the reserve ratio, increase or decrease the discount rate, and buy or sell T-bills, open market operations. And I had you draw a squiggly line and put targeted federal funds rate. Now, here's what, and I got here in the notes, and write this down, that this is a 4th question mark tool the Fed has. Okay, and it's the rate banks loan to each other at, and that whatever that is, what the Fed wants banks to do when they run short of their reserves, they want them to borrow from other banks. That's why they set the discount rate, which is the rate banks borrow from the Fed itself. They set the discount rate higher because the Fed will loan banks money if they need it, but they'd rather have them borrow from other banks. And so how do they target the federal funds rate? How do they do it? They buy and sell T-bills, open market operations. So just if I ask you this Thursday, make sure you can understand all this and explain it to me. All right, moving on, next topic. Output gaps. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I might give you a question and say, tell me what a positive output gap is or a negative output gap. One thing I found about economics is they're very tricky about how they word things. And the AP macro teachers are very wary of that this year. The fact that there's no graphs on your exam means you really, really, really going to need to know this vocabulary. And so anyway, a negative output gap is basically the same as a recession. Okay, and I'll show you this in a minute. A positive output gap is the same as an inflationary gap. Now you might want to pause this and write this down. Well, you do want to write it down. But anyway, let me show you this. This is a recession here. So you see AD is to the left of the LRAS. Now this graph is not labeled right, but who cares? This is for a college class. It is to the left of LRAS. And so what happens is if you think, remember at the bottom is real GDP. So that straight line, that is optimal output or potential output. We talked about this way back at the beginning of the 9 weeks. So the economy wants to be, and we want it to be on that straight line, but it's not. It's to the left, which means the output, which is the same thing as GDP, the GDP is lower than it should be. So that is a negative output gap. If you were actually graphing essays like they normally used to do, they would actually sometimes say that, graph a negative output gap. It confuses kids. All it is a recession. What is a positive output gap? Same as an inflationary gap. That means there's too much GDP out there. Real GDP is too high. It's above optimal or potential output. Okay, make sure you can explain that. Moving on, I got to get this video done in 15 minutes. Expected inflation. I think this is pure witchcraftery right here. I know that's not a word, but I'm going to make up my own words. Here's the theory. Okay, if people expect inflation, if individuals, consumers expect inflation, they will act on that, causing inflation to go up. Now, I don't really believe this in 100 years, but this is what the economists say. So if people believe that inflation is going to be 2%, they will go down to their boss and say, hey, I'm not going to work here unless you give me a 2% raise. Good luck trying that. And so what they do is they demand 2% raises. If your if you're pretty valuable at your job, they're going to give you a 2% raise. And what is inflation going to be then? 2%. This is like I had a friend of mine who went on a diet and lost a lot of weight. And I said, how did you lose weight? And he goes, this is going to sound silly. And it sure enough did. He said, what I do every night when I lay down to bed, I just visualize myself as being skinnier. Well, I tried visualizing myself with hair and it never worked. That is a joke. I never wasted my time with that. I do believe in a positive mental attitude. But anyway, this is the concept of expected inflation. If people believe there's going to be inflation, there will be inflation. It's what you call a self-fulfilling prophecy. And theoretically, it works for deflation too. Again, I don't believe this in 100 years, but here you go. It could be on the exam. Next topic, inflation tax. First off, this is not a real tax. A tax is when the government takes money away from you. But let's say the government needs money because it's running a deficit. So here's what they do. They just print money. Okay, now you're supposed to know already what that'll do. If the government prints some money and spends it, that's called injecting it into the economy. It's different from buying T-bills, but somewhat of the same effect. But if they print money, what it's going to do, it's going to lead to inflation. And if the government prints money, what happens to the value of the money you have or the taxpayer has? It goes down. So the theory is if the government, the public's money is worth less, and so it's pretty much the same thing as having less money, if this makes any sense at all. This actually makes a lot more sense than the other one, the last thing we talked about. If the public's money is worth less, it's pretty much has the same effect as if the government had taken, let's say your money goes down 20%. The government could have taxed you 20%. It has the same effect. You're 20% worse off, and this is nicknamed the inflation tax. Again, be able to explain that. Hold on here. Much better. This is the last topic in the unit, and it's really, really kind of complicated here. And I've got 4 minutes to do it. And you're going to do some writing here. Okay, first thing, and you don't need to write this, but you are very likely to get this as one of your 4 questions. And by the way, your questions aren't tomorrow, which is Wednesday. I'm recording this on Tuesday. Your questions are Thursday. And I'll text you out what time it's going to be and everything. But anyway, it'll be in the morning. But very likely to get this as one of your 4 questions. All right, so you want to definitely memorize this. And I'm going to give you the long definition and the short definition. All right, so let's say the economy's in a recession. Economy's in a recession. What can the Federal Reserve do? Well, it buys T-bills. When it buys T-bills, it shifts the money supply line to the right. Nominal interest goes down. As interest gets cheaper, aggregate demand goes up. Recession is over. But the LRAS, the straight line, remember that is potential output, has not changed. All we're doing is dancing around that line. The economy will adjust there. But this kind of hurts that I'd never finished the concept of sticky wages with you. We got in a hurry when I was doing Unit 3, and I said I would do it later, and I still haven't done it. I talked about it briefly, but I promise you I will do that. If everything goes okay, I will do that here in the next couple of weeks. You need to understand that. But the economy would have adjusted itself anyway. So it just has a short-term effect. Okay. Now let's put it the other way. Economy has an inflationary gap. The Fed sells T-bills. So the money supply line shifts to the left. Money supply line shifts to the left. Nominal interest goes up. Nominal interest goes up. People buy less houses, less cars. Aggregate demand goes down. The inflationary gap is over, but it's just a short-term thing. The economy would have adjusted itself in the long run anyway. And I'm going to say it again. I have not explained to you in detail enough. I will try to do that next week. What I mean about the economy would have fixed itself anyway. So this is the long, complicated definition. Here's the short version, which you want to memorize, because it's possible I'm going to give every single one of my econ kids the money neutrality question. So here is the short answer. In the long run, money or money supply is neutral. It does not affect GDP or unemployment in the long run. In the long run, all it does is change price level. But in the long run, the money, if you Google this, it'll say money is neutral. I believe they're really talking about money supply. Remember, these are some complicated topics here. And as I explained to you earlier, they're probably very unlikely to be on the exam, but I want you to be prepared. And that is the end of the Unit 5 Miscellaneous Topics lecture.